All right, guys. So we got Paul on the podcast now. We're going to answer a couple questions for us. First one we got from the animal-based Facebook group is from Emily Jimenez. She asks, how do you guys not get tired of eating the same foods over and over? I am new to this and trying not to get discouraged.
This actually came up on a recent podcast that I was on. I think I was recording on somebody else's podcast, but this idea came up that a lot of people, when they start a carnivore or an animal-based diet, have concerns that they're going to get bored with limited food choices. And I think that a lot of that is based on our experience with plants. When I was on the Pacific Crest Trail, for 3.5 months, I ate the same food every day because we had to send it to ourselves when we were hiking from Mexico to Canada. It's a 2,700 mile trail in the wilderness. And I got sick of plant foods, and I've gotten sick of many plant foods in the past. But there's something kind of magical about animal foods. If you are getting meat with a reasonable amount of fat, you really will not get sick of this unless you are trying to eat as entertainment. So there are different levels of getting bored with a food. If you try and eat the same plant food every day, your body will begin to rebel against that plant food, primarily because of the alkaloids and other essentially defense chemicals that are in the plant foods. When I was a runner, when I was a vegan, when I was 25 to 30 pounds of muscle lighter, I ate wheatgrass every day. And I got so sick of wheatgrass one day, it was like a light switch just switched in my body. And I came home and I made wheatgrass and I believed it was good for me and I couldn't even stomach it. I got super nauseous because of the alkaloids. That's clearly a chemical phenomenon. And so getting sick of their food, then that's probably not going to be an issue when you're eating fruit and meat and organs, as long as you're getting fat. If you are actually getting bored of those things, that I would challenge people to imagine it. You can use food as entertainment, but it's not going to be the best way to get healthy. You're going to have to prioritize either food as health, food as optimal wellness, or food as entertainment. They're mutually exclusive. But generally speaking, people are wildly surprised at how much they don't get sick of food when it's animal foods. The only time I'm going to see people get sick of animal foods is when they're not eating enough fat. If you eat meat that's too lean.
Makes total sense. Total sense. Now, next question we have from the animal-based Facebook group is from Jan Josuede. Is some alcohol acceptable on an animal-based or carnivore diet? Where would it fall on your toxicity scale? And what would be a good beverage every now and then, if there are any?
So in terms of alcohol, I think people have to understand that an animal-based diet is not meant to be dogmatic. People will often say, can you eat X, Y, or Z on your diet? And I want to give people a framework, but I also want to respect people's sovereignty and say, like, you can do whatever you want on any diet. Like, it's not meant to be so limiting that you're off the diet or you're off the team if you don't do these things. Having said that, I don't think alcohol is going to really result in better health for humans, but I think most humans are going to want to drink some alcohol. So I do have a controversial thoughts on this that I released around New Year's, which is the least toxic alcohol. Maybe we can link to that in the show notes or something. But generally, I think if you want to drink alcohol, go for the clear distilled alcohols, things like vodka or gin or tequila or mezcal. And then the darker the alcohol is and the more quote unquote contaminants and congeners it's going to have in it that are going to cause problems. If the alcohol is made from grains that can get moldy, you could have more mold contaminants in things like beer and wine. There's a lot more mold contaminants in those than there is in things like vodka. It's all going to be potentially problematic, but the purest form of alcohol that you can find is probably going to be the best to drink. And by that, I mean the least bad. But I want people to still be able to enjoy their life, just to understand that if you have a couple drinks one night and you don't wake up feeling great the next morning, it's probably not the meat or the honey or the fruit. It's probably the alcohol. So you just may not feel great if you do that, but let people live their lives. Having said that, I think most people want to know what the best alcohol to drink is. And I think it's the clear ones mixed with something. In terms of other drinks that would not be alcoholic, I like kombucha. You want to be a little bit careful about kombucha with added herbs and how you're going to react to those. I avoid kombucha with lavender. Lavender definitely has some, xenoestrogenic, some phytoestrogenic properties. If I'm going to drink kombucha, I usually just try and get a simple kombucha, either a plain flavor or just a fruit-based kombucha. That's just my personal preference in kombuchas. But there's also sparkling water in that realm as well. And then people can also make water kefir is a thing, kefir, kefir, whatever. So those are the drinks that I would recommend. Here in Costa Rica, there's a lot of like coconuts and coconut water as well that I think are fine. See how you react to those. And so those would be probably the top choices. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question is from Felicia Campanelli. So what are some tips you have for people with already high movement levels? People who are weightlifting very often, they're doing marathon training. They might even be doing runs during the week as well, like with their weight training. How would you kind of structure their diet? Would you recommend more fruit or less? How would you recommend that?
I think that for most people, 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrates a day is going to be enough no matter what you're doing. But I certainly think that if people are more active, you could increase the carbohydrates beyond 100 or 150, which is where I think most people kind of end up, when they're doing an animal-based diet. You could certainly increase the carbohydrates. You also might want to increase the protein a little bit, maybe increase the fat a little bit. Basically, those people are just going to need more calories. And it's going to be individual in terms of what they're going to feel like they perform best with. But I think it's fine to eat more fruit. If you don't want the fiber that comes with the fruit, you could eat more honey. I think you'd be fine increasing the calories from carbohydrates as long as you're getting enough protein. Don't let the calories from carbohydrates crowd out the protein from the meat and the organs. So, yeah, but I think it's fine to increase the carbohydrates.
Sweet. And Ryan even mentioned too how he had a little bit of a pitfall with doing a lot of exercise and not eating enough carbohydrates. So that makes total sense. Next question from Herman Gerhard. Quick question. Is corn considered animal-based? What about grapes? How would you consider those on your toxicity spectrum?
So grapes are a fruit. You probably don't want to eat the grape seed. That's clearly the grape is trying to get eaten without the seed being eaten too much. If you do eat the seed, try not to chew the seed. I would just get seedless grapes or get grapes with seeds and spit out the seed. I would not consider corn to be animal-based for a variety of reasons. I think there's some debate about whether corn is actually a fruit or a grain. But if we're not splitting hairs here, let's just acknowledge that corn is almost all genetically modified now and is just going to have a high pesticide load, probably no matter what. Even if you're getting organic corn, I think it's going to be hard to get organic corn that's not going to have some exposure to pesticides just because of the way that corn is grown and grown in proximity to other crops that are going to have pesticides on them. So I don't think that corn is a great thing for humans in general. I would avoid it. Having said that, there were people in Tanzania who were eating corn, the Datoga, the Maasai, they love their cornmeal. I'm not sure it's terribly nutritious, but I think that there are other better sources of nutrition for humans. I would not favor corn at this point.
Gotcha. And so last question we have for you, Paul, is Jim Wright asks, something that's been on my mind recently is regarding fruit and honey. How important is it to eat them seasonally? Is it okay to consume honey and fruit during the winter months, knowing that it does not affect me personally?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So my first thought about this would be that humans are tropical beings, that we evolved in the tropics where there really was not the same sort of seasonality to a lot of these foods, that there's fruit available kind of year round, depending on what type of fruit, that the temperature is pretty consistent year round, that it's almost always availability of some source of fruit, whether it's different fruit that's in season now, and then another one comes into season, and then honey comes into season. But in the tropics, there generally are these carbohydrates available for much of the year. So my sense is that humans are kind of evolved to do that, and you don't need to really change a whole lot in the winter unless you feel better with that. Now, having said that, I think that it's going to be subject to some individual variation and some individual experimentation. If people feel better in the winter eating less fruit or less honey, you can do that. If you feel like you're gravitating toward more root vegetables or squash in the winter, you can do that, but see what works for you. But I will say that personally, I've eaten fruit through the winter and been just fine with it. Now, granted, I spent most of the past winter in the tropics at the 9th latitude, but it seemed to be fine for me. So there may be certainly some circadian variation. We have to understand that if you're not at the tropics, then the days will get shorter, which is going to change things in your physiology. So you could experiment with the foods you eat in the winter, depending where you are. I'd kind of dabbled in talking about this a little bit on a podcast with Chris Ryan in the past, that perhaps it has less to do with where our, quote, recent ancestors are from, and more to do with where we find ourselves in the world. So there's a possibility, there's a hypothesis that we should be eating based on latitude. And that sort of a hypothesis would argue that for people who are at northern latitudes in the winter, maybe you should eat less carbohydrates, or you should eat different sources of carbohydrates. So you can experiment with all of those things in mind and kind of see what works for you. I think there's probably a couple different answers there, and we're not exactly sure, but I think that it's important to entertain the possibility that there may be some benefit to seasonal variation in your foods based on latitude. But again, that's going to be different for everyone, because the winter here in Costa Rica is, 80, 90 degrees and sunny every day. So it's not winter in the same way that it might be in Nova Scotia.
That's awesome. That makes total sense. And the idea of eating based on your latitude is interesting. I totally can see how that would work for most people. Well, that's all we had for you, Paul. We really appreciate you answering a couple of those questions for us. Again, guys, if you'd like to have your question answered, please go to the Animal Based Facebook group and ask your questions in there so that we can, get those questions and hopefully get Paul to answer those. But yeah, Paul, thank you again for coming on with us, and appreciate your time.
Yeah,
man, Paul.